We're recording, we're ready to go, etc. Okay, I think you all know the housekeeping. You're all on mute. I don't have any faces apart from your pictures staring at me, so that's fantastic. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the latest C&M Recruitment webinar. Thank you for taking the time to join us today from your undoubtedly very, very busy days, especially with the recent communication from the government on Tuesday and what's going to be happening today at 12:30 as well. I'm sure and I hope it's going to be an extremely informative and useful session for all of you, including myself as a business owner and leader as well. Today is going to be really geared around you as owners and business leaders, and the next stages, all about staff, furlough, redundancy, and so on. I'd like to introduce my esteemed panel of ladies. Claire Steiner, who from the GDTP, a very good friend of mine, and also sits on the ITT board as well, an extremely knowledgeable HR professional, and also Ami Naru from Travlaw. I have written her job title down because it is this long. She's the partner and head of employment for professional purposes at Travlaw. So what she doesn't know about employment law is not worth knowing about. We also have my colleague Mark Shapiro, who is unvideoed at the moment, and we've got Matt Gatenby, there's Mark, and Matt Gatenby as well from Travlaw, who will be our glamorous assistants looking after all the questions and the chat below in the chat room. So we really want this to be an interactive, informative, debate almost. We have some questions already that people have contacted us about, so please feel free to ask all your questions down below. We will either answer them during the session, and it's going to be very free-flowing, or ask them afterwards, answer them afterwards as well. We are also recording the session, so anything that you missed, you can always catch up on afterwards. We're also delighted to be partnering again with Travel Weekly and their Roadmap to Recovery campaign. And we've got Lucy Huxley, Editor-in-Chief, with us, and Juliet Dennis, Chief Reporter, here today, who's going to be reporting on the session. Before we kick off, as I said, we're going to make it quite interactive, and we would like to do a couple of polls. So the first thing we're going to do actually is just share my screen on the presentation, and it is this one. Is that all right, everybody? We can see that, yes? Claire and Ami, are you there?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. Okay, so the first poll, I'm just going to test the polls first of all. It's a nice, easy question. There we go. Have you managed to go on holiday this summer? Just please test us. Just please do it so we can test it. Well, I have, which is great. Half and half, half and half. Well, I hope most of you have. You've managed to get away. So 45% yes, 45% no. Well, oh, slightly more. Fantastic. I'm glad some of you have managed to. That's good news. Great. Okay, let's kick off. Share results, there you go. So it's all technology. So you know who we are. Let's kick off with this. Okay, quick synopsis of C&M. I think the majority of you know who we are. We work with a number of you anyway. We partner with you. We've worked with you in the past. But just an overview, C&M are now almost 23 years old, and we have a breadth of travel industry experience. Myself, I've been in the industry almost 30 years. All my staff have worked in the industry as well. Travel is our passion. We absolutely love it. What has happened in the last 6 months has been devastating for us all. It's been the hardest 6 months of our careers, but we are very, very confident that we are going to get through it because we are as tough as the industry. We work with all sectors, be it OTAs, tour ops, TMCs, you name it. So we like to think that we are in a good position to be able to answer a lot of your question, and we work for all companies, all levels, all types of roles. Not so much recently, but it is slowly beginning to trickle back. Just a couple of stats really from our perspective. Year on year, vacancies are down 95% since lockdown in comparison to year on year to 2019, which is quite a shocking, but probably not a surprising stat. And applications, candidates registering, are up by 60% since lockdown compared to 2019, which is also quite interesting. The positive news from C&M's perspective is we are seeing a slow return from companies who are beginning to recruit again, probably for the more essential roles. We're finding these are coming mainly due to restructures, redundancies, unfortunately, which are then forming new roles, and also a little bit of expansion here and there. And not coincidentally, the types of roles are finance, marketing, and IT tech roles. That's on the whole. And that's across the board: OTAs, tour ops, luxury villa specialists, and even TMCs, which is fantastic to hear. And I have to say, the last couple of weeks we've really seen a slight increase in businesses that are robust. They have the cash to be able to forward plan in their hiring plans, have begun to think about the future and think about the staff they're going to be taking on. So today we're going to discussing what comes next: staff returning to work, end of the furlough scheme, working from home for the next 6 months or not, increasing flexible working, further potential redundancies, and protecting your brand. Which brings us on to my colleagues, Ami and Claire. Flexible working. Would you like me to set a poll up, Claire and Ami?
Go on then.
Yes, please.
Okay, we'll do the flexible working poll. Let's have a little look. Flexible working. So audience, have you increased the flexible working options for your staff since the beginning of the pandemic? I'd be very surprised if this hasn't got a majority of yes, with you ladies, but it's just interesting to see.
Quite clear cut, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah. No, 3%. Oh, there's one that said no. So that's very interesting. But the majority, of course, have increased the flexible working options. Okay, thank you very much, everybody that took part in that. So.
Yeah, thanks, Basha. So Claire and myself will talk about the bullet points on this next slide. I think it comes as absolutely no surprise to anyone that the numbers of people working flexibly and indeed working from home has increased. Just to run some figures by you, in 2005, out of the working population in England, only 8% worked from home on a regular basis. Those figures in 2014 had increased to 14%. And during the lockdown period, that figure rose to 86% of the working population were working from home at some point. So even without COVID around, the numbers of people working from home has steadily been increasing over recent years. But obviously there was a massive knock-on effect with COVID, and the vast majority of people were working from home. So what does this mean? Obviously, we had the Prime Minister's announcement on Tuesday, about over the summer months, there very much was the encouragement that people who are working in offices should return to office work. And then there was a bit of a U-turn, and it was basically now being encouraged that if you can work from home, you should work from home. Slightly different, it's encouragement as opposed to insistence, as it was earlier on in the summer and in spring, where you definitely should work from home. So I think it's inevitable that in the coming months, and as we start to hopefully one day come out of this wretched COVID issue, the numbers of flexible working requests are going to increase. Okay, some of you may already have had flexible working requests. Some of you probably might not even realise that you've had a flexible working request, and I'll deal with what that is in a minute. But essentially, it's a change to their normal working pattern now, whether that's from their place of work, their hours of work, or if they've got childcare. arrangements or issues with those that are impacting them working during the day, whether they change their hours to work in their evenings, for example. So what is a flexible working request? It's a statutory request. It's a statutory procedure that is set out by the government as to what employers have to do. Now, it's important to note that only employees with 26 weeks continuous service can make a flexible working request. They can only make one in any given 12-month period. They must make that request in writing, so email will be suffice. And in that request, they need to set out how any detrimental impact on the business will be alleviated. Okay. Once that request is received by you as employers, what do you need to do? Well, you need to deal with it in a reasonable manner, and the guidance sets out that 3 months is probably more than enough to have the various meetings. Ideally, you should have a meeting. I appreciate that given the current circumstances that we're all working in, meetings aren't going to be easy, so a phone call or a Zoom meeting will be suffice. But what are your options? You talk through what the request is. You can either accept the request, in which case you need to do contract variation or a side letter amending the contract, and that needs to be set out in writing within a month of that change taking effect. You can say, well, we're not quite sure, but what we're prepared to do is consider this on a trial basis and then review afterwards as to whether it's going to be a permanent or change, or whether actually we've given it a go but it simply doesn't work for us. The one positive of doing that is if you do ultimately say, no, this is not going to be the case moving forward, at least you can show that you've acted as a reasonable employer and you've given it a go. The third and final option is that you can reject that application for flexible working. So if someone says, I've worked during lockdown from home on a permanent basis and I want to carry on doing that, okay? You can reject it, and there are 8 prescribed grounds upon which you can reject that, and you need to look at what those grounds are. The burden of additional costs, the inability to reorganise existing staff to work around those arrangements. You know, I've given you a couple of examples there. You can't just simply turn around and say, no, that's not for us. The added complication now is that obviously a lot of people have worked from home during lockdown and have proved that they can do it. So whereas you could probably easily rely on a reason to reject it, those reasons may not be readily available. And then, okay, let's assume someone's requested and someone wants to work from home on a permanent basis. You've amended the contract. You also need, and I can't emphasize this enough, a home working policy. Why do you need one of those? Well, what happens with data? Okay, if people are printing stuff off at home, where are they disposing of it? Are they just chucking it in their recycle wheelie bin, or are they just leaving it lying around? What happens if their house gets broken into, for example, and they leave their house unattended? What happens if they are sitting in Starbucks and working from there, and you know, who can see their screen? What are they doing with their data? So data protection. The other thing is, just because someone's working from home, it doesn't alleviate the employer from their obligations and health and safety regulations. You still have to provide a safe working environment. If it's going to be a permanent arrangement, you should be undertaking a risk assessment. And also,
and I'm assuming employer's liability, Ami, is employer's liability needs to be sorted out on the insurance side as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That was just what I was coming on to.
Apologies.
Yeah. So just going back to health and safety, it's not just about providing the equipment, it's about, well, you know, all of us have experienced this to some extent whilst we've been working from home, a bit of loneliness, a feeling a bit alienated, a bit isolated. How are you going to make sure that, you know, these people working from home don't end up bringing a stress claim against you? So that's why working from home policies are really good. And then insurance, you've touched on that already, Basha. If you're providing equipment for them to take home, is the employer covering that under their own insurance? Or is the employee required to make sure that they have it covered in their home and contents insurance? Does their mortgage even allow them to work from home and carry on business from home? You know, there are all those factors that need to be considered. As I've already said, you need to amend your contracts to reflect whether it's a permanent change. and whether you've got a right to revert and say, after so long, we're going to say, actually, you're going to come back into the office on a regular basis. Also, if working from home is going to be their permanent place of work, are you going to put into that contract that X number of times there is a requirement they attend the workplace or for meetings and whatnot? Are you going to reserve the right to enter so that if they have got work equipment at home and you have to come into their property to repair it, are you going to build that into the contract? The other thing that you need to think about as well when you're looking at flexible working requests are discrimination. Okay, if someone's got a disability, you have a duty to make reasonable adjustments. Okay, the second thing is, if you are rejecting a female applicant's request for to work from home because of childcare arrangements, that may end up being indirect discrimination, because statistically, it's well known that more women than men have childcare responsibilities. Okay, now, and that's not to say that it will always be discrimination. What it means is that you have to objectively justify why it's the case that you can't allow that person to work from home. And there has to be some legitimate interest or aim that you are trying to fulfill. And that goes back to the 8 reasons that are prescribed as to why you can reject a flexible working request. The other thing is, and this will probably be a nice segue to bring you in, Claire, is you're going to have to adopt different management styles, because how you deal with people in the office is not going to be the same as to how you deal with people working from home. So on that note, Claire, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Ami.
And can I just interject? Apologies, Mark and Owen have just asked, don't forget, audience, we've got the chat room, so if you have got any questions, please put them down in the chat room below. I think you've all got, I can't see it because I've got my presentation in front of me, but the chat room is down there, guys. Yeah, you can see it.
Yeah.
Okay, so
No, thanks, Ami. I had one quick thing to add to things that you need to think about, because I've read increasing information which is public, so I think employers are going to be picking up on it, which is the tax implications of working from home and who's responsible for paying their, they may, I mean, most homes these days come with full broadband and internet, but should the employer be picking out some of those costs? And there are tax implications to that. I'm not a tax specialist, but you all have accountants, and I recommend that you maybe talk to them about what that means to you, should one turn around and say, okay, from home.
Claire, can I just come back in on that point? There's a few things around. We're not tax experts, neither Claire or I, or indeed Basher, are tax experts, and we'll hold our hands up to that readily. But yeah, if their place of work is going to be home, are you going to allow them to claim expenses when they travel into the office, for example? Claire's already mentioned about household expenses, and those of you who follow Martin Lewis, he's been going on about the fact that you can claim £6 a week back towards your expenses as a tax rebate. And again, if you're providing equipment to your staff, is it solely for work purposes, or is it a benefit in kind that they can use their computer for their own personal use, etc., and therefore is it a taxable benefit? So I think that's all I want to say on tax, because that's about as much as I know about it. But you probably do need to not just only take legal and HR advice, but you also need to speak to your tax advisors about this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as an employer, I think everyone's been very, very aware during lockdown that they've needed to keep in touch with their teams, to try and keep the culture going, making sure that people's mental health is okay, as well as their physical health. And of course, mental health is a huge focus globally, but particularly in the UK, I think, with so many sort of high-profile celebrities coming out and endorsing it and publicly talking about the need to look after it. And this will continue. And I think just, as we come out of this period, and we will see more and more people working from home, there still needs to be a focus on how those members of staff are coping. Even if it's only 2 days a week they're from home, there's still going to be a need to keep that thing going. So I think, there are a number of things that we need to consider. One is the skills basis. So, there are different skills that potentially needed to work remotely. And do your staff have those? Do we need to start thinking about, some training courses to help people with remote working needs and how they can actually do their job more effectively from a remote perspective. And I say remote these days because I don't think it's about home working, I think it's about remote working. And as Ami said, you know, they could be in Starbucks, they could actually be sitting on a beach somewhere working if they were lucky enough to be able to do that. And wouldn't we all love to be able to do that at the moment? But, you know, remote working is going to change fundamentally the skills that we need in our organisation to ensure that we continue to meet our targets. And that actually expands to the managers themselves. And I think, you know, some people are fantastic people managers when they can do face-to-face, and they're those sort of very engaged, extrovert type of people that often will struggle when it comes to remote working themselves. So we've always seemed to think focusing on our teams and their mental health, but it's really important we think about our own health as well, and how we are having to adapt as managers of people and, you know, and managing people remotely. I think I've always been a fan of flexible working, and I think what's really interesting is we're starting to see some stats coming forward, and I haven't got specific stats, but certainly a shift towards the change in companies' thinking around the targets and what constitutes meeting their obligations as a member of staff and their jobs, which was a shift from presenteeism, which is when basically they're at work and they're seen to be at work, so therefore they must be working if they're in the workplace, which of course doesn't count at the moment, to actually looking at results orientation. So, you know, it's saying, right, if you're working from home and you may have childcare issues, you may have caring issues, you may be someone who actually has always worked really well from 6 a.m. until 3 p.m. or the other end of the scale, but you're doing your job and you're producing the results. And therefore that whole flexible working and how managers need to retrain the way they see the staff working needs to happen. I think that's really critical. So, you know, you need to think about that again when you're talking about flexible working. Everybody works in different ways, in different paces, and that can be a real bonus to your business, but you have to actually think about that when you're looking at your working patterns and how your staff and your work are going to adapt and work in this new, and I hate to say it because we're using a lot, but this new normal and this new office environment that we will find ourselves in.
If I can add something, Claire, there as well, on the flexible remote working, should we say, all of the vacancies that we have got on in the last 6 months, especially in the last month or so, that has been one key thing that the client and the candidates we're speaking to have been talking about, that how much flexible working is that, how many days in the office, how much time remote stroke at home, which the client is now, on most vacancies, is now offering as part of the course. And most candidates that we're speaking to, of which we have a few, I'm sure you can appreciate, they're all asking for that option as well of more home working. And I totally agree with you, Claire, about it's a different skill set. Some are going to be great at working from home, some aren't, and we've talked about this in the past, haven't we, that some more introvert people might be better working at home because they're left to their own devices and they can just get on with their work and not be surrounded by a team of very extrovert, loud salespeople. On the flip side of that, if you thrive on being in a sales environment, being with your team, and you work in a team environment, working from home isn't always going to be the right thing for your teams out there. So it's something that it's fantastic, I think, because it gives another whole option that you as business owners can give to your staff. But there's also so many other elements that we need to think about from an HR and a legal perspective, isn't there?
There are.
Yeah.
Sorry, Bammy, carry on.
I was going to say, there's some clients that I'm speaking, there's definitely pros and cons of both. And I think ultimately you've got to do what's right for you and your organisation and you and your own people. And it's not a case of what fits for that organisation is going to fit for you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's definitely on an individual case. I think, but just to sort of put a slight negative spin on that, there is an issue then, of course, if you have some people that you know work better from home and other people who don't. And then when all those people are asking for flexible working, you justify saying yes to one and no to another based on that, which you probably, I'm looking at you, Ami, for that. I think that's going to be again, it's about
a whole can of worms, isn't it? It's
knowing your staff, having those human conversations and finding the best solution.
Yeah, I think what I would add as well is that, you know, despite the guidance from the government about working from home during the COVID period, these are temporary changes. They do not permanently change an individual's contract of employment, okay? The individual employees have a right to request. They don't have an automatic right to work from home. And I think that really needs to be drilled in as quite a key point. But as I say, and I think we all agree that on this point, that moving forwards, not just when people are applying for jobs, but also people who are in situ and have been in situ for a while, there is now going to be a greater expectation that can we do some, if not all, of our job from home.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's the key, really. It's not guaranteed. It's the request.
I've had an I'll say anonymous message actually to me privately, which I think Ami, you can probably comment on as well, which I think is around monitoring of staff. And you know, a lot of contracts allow people to monitor emails and all this sort of stuff. And I think, you know, with people working from home, some employers, I'm not saying all, but some may feel a need to do more of that. But I go back to what I was saying around it's got to be about results rather than presenteeism, because we know that someone sitting there bashing away for an hour and a half might do more work than someone who's there for 8 hours. So I think, again, just going back to skill sets and things like this, you're looking at your performance management that you have in your organisation. It's got to be results driven, because at the end of the day, if people are doing their job and they're doing it well, then should we be worried about how long it takes them to do it? I think we would if it took them twice as long as someone else to do it, then there's going to be an issue there. But if someone does something in 6 hours and another does it in 8, you shouldn't be actually penalising people on that basis, or, you know, focusing on looking and watching them, almost that sort of big brother thing. So, you know, yes, of course, you still have the rights to monitor your staff communications to make sure that things are legal and okay, that they're not doing something that's illegal and prohibited. But you shouldn't be sitting there going, well, they've only been online for 20 minutes this morning, so they must be sitting there having a cup of coffee with a mate online. That's not the case at all. You have to, there's more trust is needed in this situation. And again, I think pre the pandemic, when so many people didn't work from home, there was always going to be a little bit of an issue of trusting your staff to get on and do with it from home. Whereas actually now it's proven that it can work. Not everyone does it, but the majority of people have proven to be trusted to get on and do their job. And some have actually thrived in that environment as well.
Yeah, I think trust is always the one that, well, how do we know they're pulling their weight from home? You know, how do we know that they're not slacking off? How do we do this? And I think all of those points that you say, Claire, I agree with. And, you know, if you are going to be monitoring your staff's emails, they need to know that, okay? You need to have a clear policy on that. So you can, if you want to, and you want to be big brother about it, you can go in and see what time they've been starting sending emails and what time they're finishing. And, you know, you're going to have to think outside the box as to how do you assess performance whilst people are working from home. So there is very much a trust issue here. And I think the longer people do it and the longer people can prove themselves, then I think that should, you know, resolve itself in due course.
Fantastic.
It's that initial panic, isn't it? How do we know? How do we know?
Absolutely. And of course, if people are doing their jobs double as quickly, Claire, then fantastic. If they work full day, we can get double the amount of work out of them and results.
Yeah, exactly. And let's not forget one other thing as well, that when people are working from home, a lot of the time, the home work boundaries seem to disappear. So sometimes you do feel people actually work a lot harder and a lot smarter when they're working from home.
Yeah. Because they feel they have to prove themselves. I'm finding that with some of actually with colleagues, and not my team at C&M, but other people, they feel they have to almost justify their existence. So yeah,
I think you as a manager, you need to be aware of that, because there is a risk of that over presenteeism. You know, I talked about presenteeism earlier, but actually these people who are working too long hours, because and that's not healthy either, because actually some of my clients, they have members of staff who are younger people who may be in a flat share. So actually the place they often are working from is their bedroom. So they are not leaving the same four walls for most of the day, and that's not healthy.
No, absolutely.
You know, so you just, again, it's about knowing your staff, having conversations, understanding everybody's individual circumstances. Yeah, sure you're looking after them and responding to it appropriately.
Fantastic. I can't see any of the chat, any of the questions. So I'm not sure if we've got any, but we'll move on now on to potential redundancies. We also, audience, have a poll on here. So shall I get the poll going?
Please.
My esteemed panel. Okay, so do bear with me one moment, please. Here we go. So the next question to everybody. What is your redundancy situation? Have made no redundancies and have no plans to do so. Fantastic situation to be in. Have made no redundancies but plan to make some more. Have made redundancies but have no plans for more. And have made redundancies and plan to make more. Through no fault of your own, I'm sure. So there we go. Ami and Claire, you can see this, yeah? Okay, it's all about equal, isn't it?
It's quite split down the line.
It is, isn't it? Yeah, it doesn't. It's not a surprise.
No.
No. Well, but the first one's quite a pleasant surprise. Have made no redundancies. Have no plans to do so. So what a great position, which everybody wishes, I'm sure they were in, but unfortunately it's a sign of the times. 23% have made no redundancies but plan to make some. 19% have made some, no plans for more, and the majority, so 33%, have made some and are planning to make some more. But I'm sure the announcement at 12:30 from Sunak may impact and affect that decision as well. So thank you very much for answering those questions.
Yeah, I mean, those
let's move on to this then.
Those results don't come as any surprise, and I think it's largely because each time employers who are thinking about making these decisions have held on to see what is the government going to announce next, what is the government going to announce next. And we know now that the flexi furlough scheme is going to end on the 31st of October. That will be it. The massive concern is, and it may still be the case, we don't know what's going to be announced at lunchtime, is that was going to be the cliff edge, that all those companies who managed to keep their staff on furlough were going to have to make big numbers of redundancies. Unemployment figures are going to go much higher than they already are now. I think, you know, we can all agree that the furlough scheme has been of some benefit. I mean, it's cost the government close to £40 billion, and they simply can't sustain that. What's going to happen at lunchtime? There's lots of speculation. I'm sure you've all read the news and read the papers. I think it will mirror something along the lines what's already happening in France and Germany. But let's not forget, their schemes were in response to COVID. They've had these schemes for many, many years. My guess is, if you want me to speculate and put my hat on.
Please do, Ami, please do.
Yeah, I think what's going to happen is that it will be basically people have to work at least 50% of their hours, and there will be a subsidy from the government for those lost hours. So it's not going to be a case of people just don't need to work anymore. They're going to have to work at least 50% of their hours, because the whole point is to get industry back up and running. However, as we appreciate in the travel industry, that's not as easy, because it depends on other factors as to whether people can travel, whether people have to isolate. So I think that's what's going to happen. But let's see what happens at lunchtime. I'm sure.
And if you're thinking of making redundancies because you don't have the business there, if you have to guarantee 50% of people coming back and there's no work for them, then I don't think it's a like for like swap, is it really?
Yeah.
Right.
If there is no work, then unfortunately, I'm afraid redundancy is going to have to take place, because there's nothing for them to do for 50% of their time, let's say. If there's a little bit of work, then, you know, people are going to have to fill, or employers are going to have to fill their time to 50% in the hope that things are going to improve or get better in the near future. And that's what it is, isn't it? Holding on to hope.
Yeah.
And so let's see, you know, we could sit here all morning and speculate, but we'll soon find out what that scheme's going to be. Okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just going to say, I'm very similar to you. I think it'll be quite similar to, and I was practicing this, it's the Kurzarbeit, isn't it, that they do in Germany. I think there'll be some differences and stuff from an HR perspective I'll be interested in looking at, which is, 50% of the time, does that have to be work? Can you actually then maybe draw down on some of the government apprenticeship funding to retrain staff in that 50 time? That's a big question. I think a potential opportunity. But also for the 50% of the time that they're not working and the government is subsidising the working, could they actually go out and get another job? Will that be allowed? I think there's all those.
Yeah. I don't be surprised, guys, that when this announcement is made by the government at lunchtime, It will be brief. It's not going to answer all of those questions, and there will be some guidance that comes in the following weeks, hopefully before the 31st of October, which is where the devil in the detail will be. But going back to this situation, you know, unfortunately, I still think that despite what is announced at lunchtime today, there are going to be some more redundancies in the coming months. And indeed, I'm aware that employers, with the imminent date, the 31st of October approaching, are now entering into consultation periods with their staff about redundancies. And just to recap, okay, only someone with more than 2 years service can claim unfair dismissal, okay, and only someone with more than 2 years service is entitled to a statutory redundancy payment, okay. Some of you may have more enhanced redundancy terms. I think in this current climate it's probably unlikely, but if you have to adhere to those, okay. The first hurdle that an employer needs, there's two hurdles I always say to employers that you need to jump over to avoid an unfair dismissal claim. The first is there has to be a fair reason for dismissal, okay? In most cases, there is a diminished requirement for work. That hurdle we're going to jump over very easily. Not to undermine it, but, you know, the facts speak for themselves. We know what's going on in the world and we know what's going on in this industry. The second hurdle is the one that most employers fall down because they haven't taken appropriate advice or they haven't done their research, which is following a fair procedure, okay? Following a fair procedure, it may sound complicated, but it's relatively easy, okay? And what it means is, first of all, you don't go in and straight away tell your staff that they are going to be made redundant. First of all, you place them at risk, okay? So risk means that following a consultation process, they may or may not become redundant. And the way that tribunals view this is that redundancy should really very much be a last resort that couldn't be avoided because during the consultation process, no alternative could be found, okay? So you put them at risk, you have at least 2 consultation meetings where you try and find alternatives. So you set out the scene. Unfortunately, this is the case, guys, as to why your role, and it's always the role of not the individual who's made redundant, is at risk of redundancy. We want to try and work with you and try and find an alternative. But ultimately, it may be the case that despite your best efforts, that redundancies do have to be confirmed, okay? Some of the alternatives that you can explore, some of them are on the screen there: sabbaticals, voluntary leave, reduced hours, short time working, pay cuts. Not everything is going to work for you as an organisation, and none of them may work, but you need to give them thought. And the whole point of consultation is that it's a two-way process, okay? The employee might turn around to you and say, actually, I was thinking about taking some time out anyway. How about I take a sabbatical for 6 months and we can come back and revisit the situation, okay?
I thought it's come to timesheet training.
We've got somebody who's not muted. Let me have a look. Oh, I can see who it is. I'll mute them. Okay. Done.
So it's very much about making sure that you follow a fair process. So putting them at risk, looking at alternatives, and entering into a consultation period. Now, some of you are probably thinking, well, how long do we have to consult with our staff? Now, it very much depends on how many numbers you are thinking about making redundant. If you are making 20 or more individuals redundant or putting them at risk of redundancy within a period of 90 days at one establishment, you have to enter into a minimum 30-day consultation period before you can give your first notice of redundancy. And that period jumps up to 45 days if you're making 100 or more redundancies. You also have to enter into collective consultation. Now, whether that's with the unions or elected representatives, it might be, it depends on whether you've got unions recognised or involved in your organisation. If you're making less than 20 redundancies, then it's what's reasonable in the circumstances. My view, and I don't know what yours is, Claire, that if you are rushing this whole process through in less than a week, you are probably not giving it justice or the right amount of time and consideration.
Completely agree. Completely
and
agree.
I think you will probably be at quite a high risk, therefore, by an employment tribunal saying, well, wasn't your decision already predetermined? Hadn't you already made your mind up? So why were you going through this process? Because you've just rushed through it all. And also, finally, if your redundancy procedure set out a right of appeal, make sure you've got someone independent available to look at it with a fresh pair of eyes who hasn't already been involved in the process.
Yeah, fantastic.
So that's all I wanted to say in terms of a recap, but I'm sure, Claire, with your HR hat on, you may.
I've had a question. Actually, I've had a question. I don't think you covered this, but on a sabbatical, are your employees allowed to go and get another job?
It very much depends on what you've agreed in that arrangement.
But okay, there we go.
Yeah, and I think also just remember within your current contract of employment, you may have restrictive covenants about the sorts of things they can do to work. So, but again, you can actually make an agreement that you're happy for them to almost break that restrictive covenant for that period, given the circumstances. However, as Ami will say, and I always say, make sure it's documented. Make sure it's agreed, signed, and everyone's very clear on that.
Make sure it's exactly, and speak to your employer. They may be understanding of you going and getting another job elsewhere. To take, get you through the period. They might not be so understanding to keep your job open for you, and then you're going to go and wait for a competitor. So yeah.
So just be really aware of that. And I think also, going back to the point about the length of time for consultation, irrespective of whether it's, 2 or 3 people or 50. The reason for, as Ami says, what's reasonable is you never know what alternatives they will come up with. I mean, we've listed some potential alternatives there, and those are the usual ones. But it's, at the moment, people are worried and they're nervous, and they will be prepared to negotiate with you and to make suggestions to try and keep their jobs available for when things do pick up. And let's face it, it's in our best interest if those jobs are going to be needed in 3 months or 6 months.
Absolutely.
That we keep the skills in our business. So where we can avoid the redundancies, we really must. But also obviously as a business, there will be some roles that are not going to be needed for 6 months to a year at the earliest. In which case, redundancy.
I think what we're finding.
One question, sorry.
Oh, go on, Mark. Hello.
So the question was, what commitment do you have to staff who have been made redundant if you need to re-recruit sooner than expected?
Great.
Well, staff who have been made redundant, it depends how long there is between the period at which they will be made redundant and which you start recruiting again. Because if you could anticipate the need for recruitment at the time that you're making the redundancy, then is there actually a redundancy situation there at all? And I go back to the first point of jumping over that hurdle, is there a diminished requirement? I would be, but the thing is, in this industry, things are changing all the time. And normally what I say to clients is, if you are thinking of recruiting again within a period of 3 months of someone being made redundant, you need to think very carefully, because they still got that window to bring an employment tribunal claim, and you're going to have to justify it. You may well be able to justify it because the arguments, will be that it's a changing landscape. We don't know what the government's going to announce from one day to the other. That has a knock-on effect on the travel industry, and we have business needs and demands. However, at the point that individual was made redundant, there was a genuine redundancy situation.
Yeah, and I think heading on to the commitment though, and I certainly know a number of employers that have made that commitment to the staff to say, if and when they can recruit again, they'll be the first point of call, that they'll pick up the phone and which I think is the right thing to do. I mean, that's not to say they're going to ring every member of staff, I'm sure, but that certainly they will reach out to people that because at the end of the day, I know that all of you have been in this horrible situation of having to lose member of staff that you never would normally have lost, but you've been left with no alternative because of the current
and that's exactly what we're finding as well. And the challenge and what concerns us and all of us is we don't lose anybody. I think if it's 2 to 3 months, that actually you could probably put them on sabbatical. They could go and get a part-time job and come back and whatever. But if it's longer, that's the issue. And our poor members of staff need to pay their bills. So we've seen it. You can see it on social media. We are losing some very good talent from the industry, and it's heartbreaking that we're losing.
It is, and I think it's just worth mentioning that when I'm speaking to employers and making these difficult decisions, they are difficult decisions and they are emotionally involved and they're not easy decisions, and they appreciate and they realise that this is someone's mortgage, this is someone's, family that's going to be affected by their decisions. So they're not easy decisions by any stretch of the imagination.
I think everybody does know that, but it's still, as a business owner leader, it's still not, because this has been just thrown at us, isn't it? It's not like it's not like a restructure and we want to make redundancies to increase the bottom line. It's a hideous situation for us all. Do you have a couple of questions? Lee Munn has sent me a question. I don't know if you can see this question, ladies, or to me privately. Can an employee's redundancy be cancelled by the employer prior to their notice end date if any government announcement changes the situation or any other reason?
Yeah, absolutely. Isn't that the whole point of consultations, to avoid a redundancy situation? So yeah, absolutely, without a doubt. The whole point here is to try and save jobs. So if you've given notice and you can ultimately save that job, then yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Sorry, Claire, over to you. Are you done on that bit?
I was finished. I was nodding away because I had nothing to add to that.
There was one other question, Mark, I'll read this, about maternity on redundancy, actually. Could you touch on the logistics of considering staff on maternity leave for redundancy during in the COVID-19 scenario? This particular client has been told they need to give notice of risk of redundancy, but a timeline of action will help.
Yeah, I think just because someone's on maternity leave doesn't mean that they are immune to a redundancy situation, okay? You treat them exactly the same as your other staff who are at work, okay? Because ultimately, if there's no job for the individual to come back to, there's no job for the individual to come back to. However, what you need to be very careful about is that you're not choosing someone to be made redundant because they are on maternity leave and they're going to come back and make a flexible working request, or they're going to have childcare issues, or the kid's always going to be ill and the school's always going to be phoning up. So you just need to be careful about that. But the other thing that you also need to be aware of is that a woman on maternity leave has additional protection in terms of a redundancy situation, okay? So she gets automatic priority to any suitable alternative roles that may be available. So I'm not saying that you have to create these roles, but if there's one available, she goes right to the top of the tree and she gets priority. So if I give you an example, let's say you've got various regional sales centres whereby people are sat selling holidays. To streamline the business, you say, right, we're going to close all those centres down, we're going to bring it all to Manchester, and everyone has to apply for their job. A woman on maternity leave wouldn't have to do that. She would get automatically one of those roles, whereas everyone else would have to apply. So in terms of the timeline, it's exactly the same as how you are dealing with it for your other members of staff, but just be cautious about if there are any suitable alternative roles.
Yeah.
When I saw that question, I just like, oh gosh.
Yeah, I think the only other thing I would add, and Ami sort of covered this off, is a lot of people are using redundancy matrices to actually make the selection of it, which is absolutely the right thing to do because it shows a clear, honest and open process. However, a lot of the fair reasons for selection in that are things like, say, absence. Now, if a woman's been on maternity, she may have had an increase in absence, which may be pregnancy related before she went off on maternity leave. So you cannot use that criteria against her because that would be automatic discrimination. So you do need to be very careful about, it's worked in other areas, but if you do have someone in that pool of candidates, you need to review all of your criteria and make sure that you're not marking that person on a criteria that could be adversely affected because of their pregnancy.
Yeah, just touching on selection criteria very, very briefly. 2 key rules. 1, make sure it's not discriminatory, and 2, make sure you can objectively measure it. The usual one I get is, well, personality. Well, how do you measure personality?
Fit, that's a really difficult one, isn't it? When you're making redundant or letting people go because they're not the right fit, especially if they've been here after 2 years. It's a really difficult one. So the matrix works very, very well.
And things like attitude. They've got an attitude. You should be dealing with that anyway. So there could already be a record of conversation you had with that person about their attitude, their conduct. Actually, that could be used as part of the selection criteria. If you were to say, warnings on file and things like that would be fine.
I agree with that. If you've got a performance track record, an issue with performance, and there's a bit of a track record where attitude's been pulled up, yes, you can use it. But if you're just going to put all the employees' names down on a list and go down and mark them for their attitude based on nothing, then you're going to be in sticky water.
Objective, is it? It's not objective at all. But it goes back to what you said, Claire, is having a very good, solid, robust performance management process in place. If you've got that in place, then you're covered, aren't you? We have another question. Can notice period and consultation period run concurrently?
No. The whole point of a consultation period is to avoid a redundancy. If you've already given notice during consultation period, then you've already made your mind up.
There you go. Hopefully that answers your question. If you've got another one, then let me know. Okay, we'll move on to the next part. Quarantines and self-isolation. Now, do we have a poll for this? I will just have a little look. Are there any more questions behind the scenes, Mark?
Not that I've seen, no.
Okay. Let me have a look. So this is working environment, furlough. Yes, working environment, this one, isn't it, really?
I don't think we have got a poll on this one.
No, we don't. This is working environment. It's a bit, yeah, okay. Over to you, ladies.
Oh, is that okay? Is it going to be me first or you, Ami?
Go on, you go first.
I've talked quite a lot. They're probably bored of my voice by now. So.
Never.
Yeah. I mean, you know, there's obviously this whole thing around self-isolation and quarantines is obviously continuing and will continue to be something going forward, irrespective of what happens in the next week or so. It's an interesting one because there's nothing by law that says people can not go on holiday, and you can't prevent someone, if they're particularly, say they were on furlough and they went away for a week, and then whilst they were away, the country that they were in got, you know, had restrictions brought back down, and so when they got back they had to go into 14 days quarantine that might then eat into their returning to work. Now the situation you have there is what happens if they are required to be in the office, or whether they can work from home. And there are a number of rules around that. So, I mean, Ami, you can bring in on the legal stance from this, but I think it's individual, for me, it's looking at everything on an individual basis.
Yeah.
Isn't necessarily one size fits all with this.
Absolutely, yeah. I think you've got to be clear with your staff, because the thing is, you know, if you've got staff who have to isolate when they come back from whichever country it is, and they can work from home, and you're happy for them to work from home, then that's fine. But what happens if you've got a mix of staff who some can work from home and some can't work from home? What are you going to say to the people that can't work from home? Right, you've got to take holiday, or it's unpaid leave. You know, there's a bit of unfairness there. You know, I know some employers, not necessarily in the travel industry, but some other big corporate organisations have basically a carte blanche rule that if you have to isolate because you've decided to go on holiday and you have to come back and isolate, to make it fair, because we've got a mixture of people who can work from home and people who can't work from home, you're going to have to use your annual leave, you're going to have to take it as unpaid leave. So I think you need clear rules and transparency about what will happen if that is the case. And obviously this is an evolving and developing area, but you know, it's been around for a few weeks now. We know that countries get added to this list normally on a Thursday afternoon. So it's about communication to your staff, really. But just because someone has to self-isolate doesn't mean that they have an automatic right to be sitting at home and be paid for that and not work.
Yeah. Absolutely. But as you say, it's about communicating. They do, you know, there shouldn't be any surprises. They should be, you know, have that information. And at the end of the day, let's face it, while some people might argue this, we are all grown-ups and we should be able to therefore make those judgments based on what knowledge we have at the time. So yeah, absolutely, have clear-cut policies. I think with school closure, there's been a bit of, again, speculation around during lockdown what might happen over half term. And that suddenly half term might go from just a few days to 3 weeks, potentially, of schools closed. And I know parents all over the country are, you know, screaming in horror at the thought of another 3 weeks. But again, I think, you know, it's about having clear policies. And once we know if that's going to happen, then we can make our mind. But don't also forget that there is, before the pandemic, written into law, there are some allowances for time off to care for dependents. So people in your businesses that have children can take a certain amount of time, it's up to 4 weeks, it's unpaid per year to cope with these things. So it doesn't impact on any holidays they might take, or they may come to you and say, listen, I'm going to need to work really flexible hours during these 2 weeks. I hope you don't mind. My husband and I, or my wife and I, or my partner and I are going to try and sort of, you know, cope with it between the two of us, but it may mean that I'm not going to be available in the afternoons. So again, it's about having those conversations sooner rather than later, as once we know what's going on around school closures. It does, I think also you need to be prepared for emergency stuff. So local lockdowns might force local schools being closed down as opposed to elsewhere in the country. So again, just be thinking about how you will cope with this as a business, bearing in mind you already have within your policies, within your contracts of employment, the ability for people to take unpaid time off to deal with these situations anyway.
Yeah, I think that's going to be really quite common, that all of us at some point in time are going to know someone that's got COVID, and whether we have to isolate, and all it takes is one child in one class and the whole class gets wiped out in that bubble, and parents will be relied upon to look after those kids because they can't necessarily be sent off to grandparents and whatnot. I think the key point here is, if parents have proved that they can do that and look after their kids and work from home during the previous lockdown, then why is this situation going to be any different?
Yeah,
it's about being reasonable, and it's about having an open dialogue with your staff.
Yeah.
Fantastic. We do have another couple of questions, and I'm going to throw in a furlough poll actually, because we don't really talked about furlough too much, because also it's all about the future. And the question we have got, going back to redundancies again and notice period, this is an interesting one. How does one choose who to make redundant between two people who score the same on all factors?
You're going to have to introduce a deciding additional selection criteria.
Yeah.
Tiebreak, effectively, isn't it?
Yeah, tiebreaker, yeah,
or
exactly.
What you could do instead is, if you've used the selection criteria, maybe undertake a different process, which is a short interview.
Yeah.
You can probably add a bit more to that.
Yeah, no, I actually can't. I mean, I think
okay.
what I would do, I think, it's so difficult if you get down to that last two. But what is clear is you, again, have to have measurable criteria when you make that selection, so that you can't have the person who loses out coming back and challenging the outcome, which could, again, bearing in mind whatever their situation in, potentially lead to discrimination claims.
Yeah, the only thing that I probably could add to that is, if one of them's got less than 2 years service, you've got to remember, first of all, they don't have a right to any redundancy pay, so there's not going to be that additional cost. And secondly, they're not going to be able to bring any unfair dismissal claim, just in case they were thinking about doing that. So sometimes that's a deciding factor. And I know a lot of the time employers work out, right, well, these people have got less than 2 years service, in which case we can do a bit more of a shorter process, pay them their notice pay, and accrued and untaken annual leave. And that's about as much as it's going to cost the business. Whereas if you get into the realms of people with more than 2 years service, you've got that additional cost of redundancy pay.
Absolutely. And I'm sure the person that's asked, I mean, it's highly unlikely that they might be absolutely identical, but if there's one person that you would maybe prefer, then you can also tweak and adjust the matrix and the table accordingly. I'm assuming. I mean, it's not that's.
You have to be able to have objective justification.
There we go. That's the terminology I was looking for. There's another question as well. I think I know the answer to this anyway. If there is just no work available for someone because of a lost client, for instance, do you still need to have a consultation period? I'm assuming so, because they're still being made redundant. But what is the situation there?
Well, absolutely, yeah, you do, because what happens if that person says, I know there's no work, and I know there's not going to be any work for 6 months. So what I'll do is, if you're happy, I'll take a sabbatical for 6 months. You don't know what that person's going to say, do you?
Yeah. And that's what a consultation period is about, isn't it? It's about looking at all options to save that job. Is there anything out there, rather than thinking
you've got to get to the worst case scenario in this. Put yourself on worst case scenarios, which is you're sitting in an employment tribunal being looked at for unfair dismissal, and the first thing they're going to look at is, did you do everything you could to prevent this redundancy?
Yeah. The only one caveat I would say about that is, if someone's got less than 2 years service, it's still good practice, but you don't necessarily legally have to enter into a consultation process with them, because quite simply, and it's quite harsh, but they don't have unfair dismissal rights, so you can't be criticised for not going through a proper procedure.
Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay. Actually, Ami and Claire, do you want to talk about furlough at all? Because obviously we've got 6 weeks to go. We've touched on it. I haven't got a slide on it, but do you want to add anything to it or not? I mean, we have got a poll question which might lead to a little bit of debate. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I think in terms of the scheme and how it works, we all know that by now, so there's nothing really to add there. We know it's coming to an end on the 31st of October. It's more about now what's going to happen after lunchtime today and moving forward. So not from my point of view.
No, okay.
I think from which kind of segues into the next slide. I think you know, the key things we are seeing at the moment, and I think it was in the papers in the last couple of weeks, that they know, for instance, that I think it's £3.5 billion they know has been misappropriated from the furlough scheme. We're also seeing a rise in whistleblowing from employees shopping their employers, saying, I think that they didn't do the furlough scheme right, and that might shine a spotlight on your company. It might not be justified, but it does mean that HMRC might be looking at you sooner rather than later, as opposed to the 6 years we know, which they've publicly announced they will be auditing all companies who've taken part in the furlough scheme. So what is quite interesting, and we're already seeing, is some companies that are able to, and I know that that's not necessarily in our sector, who are paying back their furlough pay because they need to use it, which is a great situation to be in. That's not the case for any of us. So I'm just saying to staff, you know, to employers, just be very aware of that. So it goes on to how you're treating staff at the moment and how you treat them when they leave as well, because when they leave and how they leave is going to have a big impact on how they evaluate the business.
Absolutely. The advice that I would give there is that, you know, people have been on furlough. They have no reason to report their employer, but when redundancy starting to talk about and they've got one foot out the door, they come a bit disgruntled. So they're like, well, sod this, I've got no loyalty to that employer whatsoever. And let's not forget that this scheme was launched very quickly and we were all trying to understand it and work it out, not just you as employers, but us as lawyers as well. And there will be genuine mistakes. And you know, if you think there are genuine mistakes, then approach HMRC and try and sort them out, rather than do a retrospective audit, which they can do at any point in the next 5 years, and catch you out. And that's when the fines and everything get implemented. And you know, it's dangerous territory. So you know, if you think you've made genuine concerns, they are receptive to that, and they have said that they will overlook genuine mistakes because they appreciate that the scheme came in very quickly. And the guidance came in a drip-drop manner.
A lot of uncertainty over what certain parts of the furlough rules meant and how they could be interpreted. So I think, that would be something I think we really need to just be aware of and think about. And I don't want to put the frighteners up people too much, because it could be that it was actually a genuine mistake, and most of you, I'm sure the majority of you are absolutely fine, but that won't necessarily stop a very disgruntled member of staff just doing it out of spite more than anything else.
Absolutely. I have got a furlough question. And I've got a furlough poll as well, just out of interest to all of the audience. I'd like to actually find out how many of your staff are still currently on furlough. If you'd like to answer, please. How many of your staff? So there we go.
Oh, very even.
It is even Stevens. Yeah. Again, quite refreshing that 20% have got none of them, which has a few little green, that's a little green shoot for us, isn't it? 1 to 25, 13% is a quarter of the staff, 31% is between a quarter and half, 20% between a half and 3/4, and 20% is majority on furlough. Okay. Going back to actually your comment there, Claire, that and Ami, that it was all very unknown at the beginning, and it was a bit of a back of a fag packet, really, wasn't it? You know, at the end of March, we didn't know what was going on, and I think some companies are probably making genuine mistakes. Some other companies, I'm sure none in travel, are using it to help them. But I've got another poll actually, which would about this. It's just interesting to see. And please bear in mind, audience, this is totally anonymous. So it's regarding furlough, and do we feel that we have 100% used the furlough scheme for the correct purposes? So that could be, you might have had dead wood or not, and I'm certain the results don't surprise me, but no, yeah. And that could be for many reasons that the answer's now no, because in hindsight, in retrospect, didn't really realise at the time what it was for. So, see those answers, Ami and Claire? Are they a surprise?
Not really.
Me neither, but it's good. It's good to see. It's good to see.
It's good to see. And just to reiterate what Ami said, I think if you are worried about it, I think, you know, be proactive in that rather than wait for, you know, because they will be auditing. Don't, you know, and you don't want them. It'll be far worse for you, isn't it? You know, if they come to you and find out you've done it, rather than maybe you approach them, or just review it yourself. And if you've got, you know, an accountant or someone that has better knowledge of
yeah. Even to the point, I mean, I've had guys.
Before you go to must see, yeah. So
I've had guys on furlough, and even the paper trail to the letters, you know, confirming them coming back to flexi furlough, all of that. You need to have everything absolutely audited, and it.
Yeah. We've had a question that's come in. I don't know if anyone can see it, but can the employer use the job retention scheme payments to offset against any redundancy payments or notice salary? In short, statutory redundancy payments or any redundancy payments, no. Notice pay, quite possibly yes. And what I'm finding now is that employers who have to give a minimum of 1 month's notice according to the contract are now giving that notice whilst the individual remains on furlough for the last month of the scheme, so namely October, where you will get 60% contribution from the government. My advice is very much that you should top that up to the 100% that they would ordinarily get under their contract.
Absolutely. I've got a number of clients who are in that situation, sadly, at the moment. And this current week and the end of next week is all about, we're in consultation with people so that actually we can, if we have to issue the redundancy notice, so that they'll remain on furlough, their notice pay will be paid at full 100%. And all of my clients are the same as you said, Ami, absolutely 100% pay whilst they're on their notice. Plus obviously any outstanding holiday.
I have another question here as well, guys. A long one. Do you have any suggestions on how to justify putting someone on furlough who didn't give explicit consent and, having now been made redundant, are claiming loss of wages? Is there any line of defence that can be used? A side note, with exception to this one individual, we had 100% signed agreement.
Yeah, I mean, if we go back right to the start of the furlough scheme, you had to get consent and agreement, because ultimately what you were doing is varying someone's contract because they were agreeing to a reduction in pay. You know, at that time it was 80%. So if you've done that without their consent, then there may well be little defence that I can think of the top of my head as to why or how you would be able to defend that claim.
Yeah,
it's going for a line.
It's potentially unlawful deduction of wages, Ami, isn't it? That's
absolutely.
So, yeah.
Is it a line of credible defence that it can go for? He said it's a line of credible defence.
I can't think of one, because one, it's in breach of the actual rule of the scheme. Two, it's like Claire said, amounts to an unlawful deduction from wages. And, you know, at the time you would probably see my face on many webinars, and I kept saying, make sure you get that agreement, whether even if it's an email, something in writing, so that when the retrospective audit checks are being done, you can rely on that consent that someone has acted. It's not about whether they agreed to go on the furlough scheme. Ultimately, it's consent as to whether they've agreed to take a 20% reduction in their pay.
Yeah.
It's a whole minefield, isn't it? Absolute minefield.
It certainly is.
So much, and thank you for the questions. Moving on, the future, and there is going to be a future. I know we can't see it at the moment, but 5-6 months ago we couldn't see the wood through the trees for a week, but now at least we're seeing a little bit a month, 2 months, a quarter, half of a year ahead. So it's probably over to you, Claire.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start this one off. So those of you who know me know I've always been a big promoter in raising your employer brand and making sure that you have people wanting to come and work for you. And this is obviously all pre this year, but how, you know, we all spend thousands of pounds on marketing budgets to get clients to come to us. We should be spending, you know, a lot of money on improving ourselves as a company that people want to come and work for. Obviously, we've had to lose some really valuable members of staff during this. There are a number of staff who are still, you've managed to keep on. A few things I want you to think about. One is how you've treated staff during this will come back to haunt you or hopefully help you in the future. The staff that you have, you know, you may have staff that you want to come back as and when business picks up, and they may say no. So think about that. Because, you know, they may not like how you handle things during this period. I totally understand that this has all been about survival and you've been very focused on keeping your businesses surviving, but actually thinking about retaining the staff you still have going forward is going to be critical once we are through this and we're past the redundancy stage, and hopefully the green shoots are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, because some people may be feeling quite disenfranchised with the business, and depending on how you've worked with them and have supported them during this. Now, I'm sure all of you have supported them absolutely amazingly and have been really, you know, keeping in touch with them, but there may be some of you that actually haven't. And haven't been reaching out to your staff during this time and have just sort of, you know, they've been on furlough, so out of sight, out of mind. So think about that. So retention of staff, you need to start thinking about your future. And I know a lot of businesses are very focused now on recovery, which is great. But there's two things there: is how can you retain the staff you've got, bearing in mind some of them may be on furlough for months and months and months and maybe feeling a bit, I'm not sure if I want to go back to all of, you know, the stress of what I was doing before. Those who maybe have been working all the way through, haven't really had a break. You know, they've had their colleagues who've been off on furlough, and they're sitting there going, well, they're just sitting at home getting 80% of their salary. I'm sitting here working twice as hard, you know, for not much more. So there's all those sorts of things you need to think about. But also then your reputation as employer as we start to come out. We need to think about the next generation. We need to think about 2-3 years. We need to think about how we as a business will continue to grow and evolve out of this, and how we are viewed by the next generation of talent that we are going to need. You know, we're only on a bit of hiatus at the moment in terms of that focus that our industry needs to have. And before all this happened, we had an issue around less and less young people coming into the business world as it was, let alone looking at tourism and travel and hospitality as a focus. So start thinking about retaining the staff, how you're going to ensure that you keep the staff in, how you think about how you've looked after them, how you can improve. Do a bit of inward thinking and reflection on that. Think about how you will be perceived coming out of this. There'll be some that come out looking very, very good because of how they've treated the staff. They may have had to make a lot of people redundant, but if they've done it in a way that people have felt was fair and transparent and open and honest, and they did everything they could, including all the what we've been talking about around redundancies and consultations, then that will stand you in good stead. I will take a break now because actually I think reviewing terms and conditions obviously is something I'm looking at, but Ami, perhaps you can now go on to what's happening a lot at the moment.
Yeah, I think, you know, everything that we've been talking about, whether it's avoiding redundancies and you finding a solution with your member of staff, whether it's a reduction in their hours, a reduction in their pay, or whether we go back to working from home and whether that's going to be their new workplace. Once these changes take effect, you have 1 month now under the law to make sure that those changes are reflected in their contracts of employment or by side variation letter. The other thing about future-proofing your business is, had the furlough scheme not come along, how many of you had in your contracts of employment the right to lay off staff and the right to put them on short-time working? I probably can count on one hand how many of my clients already had that. So it's very much about update your contracts, incorporate those clauses in, because we don't know how long COVID is going to be around for, and we don't know if, you know, in future years something like this again may happen. So it's very much about making sure that your contracts are fit for purpose for what you are doing now and in the next few months and years. Yeah. Again, if you are amending contracts, your employee needs to consent to those variations as well. So you need to get that in writing and keep a paper trail.
Yeah, I was just going to add, Ami, very quickly, I completely agree. I don't think I've got any clients, certainly in this sector, who have those clauses on short-term working and layoffs. But interestingly enough, in the same way that Germany and France had all their initiatives pre-COVID, we've had that pre-COVID, and there are certain legal requirements around minimum pay and length of time that you can make those things. So they might not be the best solution, but you do need to look at it and consider it, talk to your HR department, talk to a legal advisor like Ami, and see if that's something that you should be implementing. And I do recommend it. I think, you know, we're at COVID-19, which means there's been 18 COVIDs first, and who knows how many are going to be coming in the future. So we need to be prepared, that we don't have more prepared than we were obviously in February, March this year.
Okay, fantastic. I do have another question, which actually sort of covers this, but it's also about the future and working environment, is what do I say to staff who are confused about the difference between should work at home if you can and can work at home if you can, especially in the light of the changes of the announcements this week?
Yeah, I mean, the should is a definite, isn't it? Can is encouraging people to. So what you as an organisation do, you need to basically enter into dialogue with your staff. You need to communicate, you know. Some people might have, you know, reasons why they still need to shield, or, you know, are on the list of the categories that places them at high risk. Some may have concerns about childcare or other arrangements. So there's a few options you can do: completely at home, completely in the office, or a mix of two. But it's having that communication with your staff and getting their buy-in and their say-so, so that they all feel like they are being listened to, and this is a joint effort to try and beat this thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have a client who, you know, they've pretty much said to their staff already that they don't see the office fully opening until January. That said, they've gone ahead, done all the COVID risk assessments. The office is a safe environment. So up until this Tuesday, they were saying, if you want to go into the work, you absolutely can do it, but these are the rules, and that we're limiting the amount of people that go in and anything. But actually what's been interesting is more and more people have started to go back in as a result of just one or two, because obviously we all miss the social contact. We will be staring at the same four walls for 6 months. And so there has been a gradual increase, even though they know they don't have to. Of course, they've now changed that stance to say, only go in if you really need to now. And we'd like to, just for the time being, keep you at work. They've had a couple of members of staff who have not been able to work from home, so they've kept the office open anyway. But it's just that they've been very good with communicating and keeping the staff all the way involved. It was like, you know, let's wait and see what the chancellor's, you know, and it's the senior people just constantly being out there and talking to people. So
yeah,
absolutely.
I think one final thing is that if you've opened your office or you're keeping it open, your obligation is to carry out a risk assessment and keep it under review. Don't go away. That's an ongoing obligation.
Yeah.
Okay, we've actually got a poll on this, so it'd be quite interesting now we've discussed it, what everybody's thinking. So it's about the work environment and moving forward. So following the announcement on Tuesday, how many of your staff will be working in the office going forward? None? A quarter of them? Quarter to a half, half to three quarters, and above three quarters? The majority is 0. That's not a surprise, is it, either?
Well, I think it's still fairly mixed, you know. It's not very high that none of them are going to be sending people into the office. There are still going to be some, and that's fully what I thought would be the case, to be honest, because it also depends on many factors. Some offices are small where you can't practice social distancing. Some are very big where they've actually probably got more space around them than they are cooped up in their little bedroom or, you know, in their little study. But I think this is an area that's going to be under review, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are more changes announced by the government in coming weeks.
Yeah, I mean,
all the time. We've been talking about flexible working, but actually it's about having you remaining flexible as well. And you know, because you've agreed on one thing right now that reflects the current guidelines. You know, we have to obviously continue to be agile and responding to that. And I think, I think the other thing to think about is that we're just coming into the winter months. So for those of you with offices in city centres, there'll be maybe more concerns over commuting on public transport. Actually don't want to walk because it's cold and it's raining and everything else, as opposed to the summer when people are quite happy to walk and get out and get some fresh air. So again, I think it's just constantly reviewing it and keeping them, and as Ami said, keeping those lines of communication open and stuff, and listening to them as well. Don't just make a decision based on what you think. Have those and understand what your concerns are of your staff. There'll be individual concerns, but there probably will be a number of similar concerns that you will need
to. Absolutely. So thank you very much, and thanks for all the questions. One last thing I'd like to talk about, if unfortunately you are having to make redundancies, and of course next week is the 1st of October, and if you're going to be giving people a month's notice until the end of furlough, that's it's going to be imminent, isn't it? I think most of you probably know, because most of you we work with or we know, but we've launched a portal. It's an outplacement product called Talentiering. There's no cost, it's not a sales pitch. And we just wanted to give something. Oh, our dog. Apologies. That's what happened.
That's because you said there's no cost, and I don't agree with that point. Oh, she didn't hear.
That wasn't supposed to happen. The dogs are being all good. So we've launched. I missed that, Ami. What did you say?
I said that's because the dogs don't agree with your point about it.
Exactly. Nice one. They were being so quiet next to me as the doorbell. So we launched a product basically to help the industry, to help you guys as employers and your staff, and it's got a lot of information, guides, videos, everything put into one portal in order to help your redundancies, if you like. So we've got that available. There's no charge. It's there just as an extra service that we can give you. So if it is something that you would like to have a look at or want further information, then either email myself, email talentiering@cnm.co.uk. But it's just our way of giving something back, and hopefully it will help the ones that we're making redundant. So
yeah. And can I do a quick bit of a plug as well, Bash?
Of course you can. Any plugs away.
Yeah, no, it's fine. So this will, I think Bash and I have agreed, will probably be added to the portal, but there is a number of different funding streams that have been out there to help support people, and Women in Travel have actually allocated have received some funding to help support specifically women, and I know this doesn't count for all of you, but women who've maybe lost their jobs in the last 6 months, and it has to be women and they have to be in the London area, but there is free support for these women in terms of mentoring, helping with CV, interviewing skills, confidence building exercises, skills, skills and transferable skills workshops. So if any of you are interested, reach out to me, but as I said, we're hoping to load it onto the Talentiering portal. It is time specific, so it needs to happen within the next 2 or 3 weeks in terms of applications. But if you do have any women that are working for you who live in the London area, there is some great additional free support through that as well.
Fantastic. We have another question. We have shift workers, airport staff, where flight schedules have diminished from 14 weekly to 4 weekly. We need to put them on short-time working. What do we do if they disagree to the cut in their working time / salary?
You can only put them on short-time working if you've got the right to do so in your contract of employment. If you haven't, the only way you can do it is by them agreeing to do it as a variation to their contract. And if they won't agree to do it as a variation to their contract, then unfortunately you're in redundancy territory because the work has diminished.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fair to say that, that again is part of the whole consultation exercise anyway in redundancies. But it's just, you can't just change their working hours without their agreement. It's exactly the same as if they were on furlough, and you have to have written agreement to that.
Fantastic. I hope that answers your question. I don't think I have any more questions in the chat room. I hope that answers your question, Sean. And I think on that point, we have finished. so an hour and a half. I'd like to thank everybody for coming in and listening. In an hour's time, we're going to know more information from the government. I'd like to thank Ami and Claire, as ever, for your expertise, your knowledge, your professionalism, and your input in today's session. Everybody listening, I really, really hope you enjoyed it. I hope there are some things that you can take away. You'll have a copy of the presentation. The session is also recorded, so we'll be sending this on to you, and it will be out on social media as well. I think behind the scenes we've been putting things on Twitter as we've been going through. Apologies for the dogs. We try and make it as professional as we can, but unfortunately I can't help it when the doorbell goes and there's an Amazon delivery and my dogs go crazy. Just makes us human. Oh, we have one more question, or it could be a comment. Oh, it's just stay safe. There we go. It's just thank you from everybody. So Ami and Claire, thanks again. Don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I just good luck everybody with the next few weeks. I really hope.
Absolutely. Good luck.
The positivity in and yeah. So
we're here for you. We are going to get through this. It's tough, and I appreciate how tough it is for some of you. If you need anything, any advice, any tips, we're all here. So please get in touch. But thanks again, all of you, for your time.
And you look after yourselves as well. Remember what I said about your own health, rather, as well as your staff and your business.
Absolutely.
Yeah, mental health is very important, as is physical health.
Yes, Mrs. Triathlete.
Triathlon on Saturday. Okay, everybody, thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thanks, Barbara.
I'll stop recording now.